Hello, people of YouTube. Today we will be continuing my metal series with episode 13. Today, talking about Gothic metal. So welcome, and here we go. So as you can see here on the screen, we have several Gothic images, and if you can think of what metal music might sound like, considering what these pictures kind of look like, that's going to give you a pretty good idea. But we're going to talk about some Gothic metal distinctives here. So, first of all, slower, doomier, longer songs, drawn out ideas. And so these songs are going to kind of be lower pitch guitars. The tempos are going to be slower. They're going to kind of drag along like a funeral dirge. Like they're going to be real sad and emotional and very, like emotionally heavy. And so that heaviness from this kind of metal usually comes from how slow and sort of brooding it is. And you really get to hear kind of the guitars just ring out, and you really get to hear their tone sustained. So that's a nice thing about this subgenre. Now I did say doomier up there because there is another style of metal which I'll get to called doom metal. And this does have some of those similar elements and comes from sort of a similar lineage of bands. Now I just have this keyboard here. So there's keyboards and synthesizer parts and atmosphere that are a normal part of this music. It's commonplace. And so next we're going to talk about how this subgenre is quite open to including some orchestral instruments that, so they're a little bit not traditional metal because they're going to implement some of these orchestral things, but they don't do it near to the extent of symphonic metal, where it becomes sort of a very dominating aspect of what makes that subgenre it. And so this little distinctive is really here to distinguish between Gothic metal and symphonic metal, because they're kind of like sister subgenres. So next on here, I have a range of sort of themes that a lot of the song topics are sort of about, and some of the aesthetics of album covers and all those sorts of things are sort of informed by these ideas. I have listed gloomy, depressing, romantic, desolate, evil, and sometimes fantasy. And so I have some photographs here. And finally, vocal styles in this subgenre most commonly include screaming, low-pitch male vocals, and sort of operatic and very pretty female vocals. And so there's these are some of the sort of Gothic elements that make Gothic metal what it is. And I do want to say, before we get into my recommendations within the subgenre, I'll make a bit of a note here that there are people who would consider Gothic metal a bit niche, and sort of not as big or encompassing as subgenre as something like death metal would be, for example. But I think goth metal really does have its own identity and its own artists and a whole set of qualities that make it a really set thing. And so some of the albums that I'm going to be recommending when I go to the next slide in my PowerPoint presentation here, some people would categorize those more into like a death metal genre, even though they'll say it's death metal, but it has some Gothic metal in it, sort of like as a more niche subgenre. But to me, I don't think Gothic metal is quite that niche. So I'm doing a whole video about it. So here we go. The first Gothic metal classic I'm going to do, and as you can see, I have my format. I have 2 classics, 2 favorites, and 2 interesting that I'll be talking about. So we're going to start off with classics. Number 1, a band called Paradise Lost made this album called Gothic. It's in the name, isn't it? It's one of the earlier albums of Gothic metal, and the band is in a group of bands, it's sort of historical, called the Peaceville 3, which consists of this band, Paradise Lost, and also Anathema, and also My Dying Bride. And these bands, they weren't really friends or anything necessarily, but they all kind of came out of the same place and made a similar kind of music at the same-ish time. And so they were sort of all influential to each other. And then these 3 bands would go on to be very influential to tons of other bands. And so that's one of the reasons it's a classic. It's just so influential. Anyway, this album is kind of the progenitor of a sound that's slow and very moody. Some very interesting riffs here, some kind of strange riffs. There are some of those really pretty female vocal passages here, and so it has that is an element that makes it gothic. But it also still kind of retains some of that sort of classic heavy metal thing, where there's like guitar solos on the songs too. And so it's almost proto Gothic metal, if you will, if you want to really get into a bunch of terms and qualifiers. It's absolutely a classic, and it's super, super inspirational to all the Gothic metal and also a lot of doom metal bands that would come along later. And so it's here in my classics section. It's a nice album. Next album I'd like to talk about is My Dying Bride, The Angel and the Dark River. Now, this is an album of theirs that has no screaming. Some of their albums do, and some of them don't. This one does not have any screaming, but it has very low-pitched male vocals. They sound super good. Now, this album is hypnotic in a way, sort of in that it builds on ideas that kind of use repetition, and then they explore and craft their songs based on some repetition. And so it has this hypnotic thing to it. It really kind of sucks you in. So the lyrics involved here are so depressing. They're one of the most depressing bands I think I've maybe ever heard. They're completely desolate and completely desperate for some glimmer of hope that is not found. And a lot of that is as a result of a lover who is deceased, hence the name of the band. The slow riffs of this album really allow the guitar tone to shine through in a spectacular way. There's not too many songs on this album, and all the songs are pretty long. I think it's a really brilliant album. It has, because some of the songs are long, it has some of that doominess to it that we talked about when we were looking at some distinctives, but it has those like keys and synthesizer elements and some of those lyrical themes that make it very gothic sounding. Okay, next up, Cradle of Filth. Dusk and Her Embrace is the name of the album. Now, this is a band that takes a lot from black metal, but then they sort of became this other thing. And this album sounds absolutely wicked. And I would say most of that's because of what it's taking from black metal, but it has some of those vocal styles that we talked about. So it's gothic to be sure. It has a lot of those gothic themes, but it has its fair share of evil as well. And the different vocalists, they perform sort of opposite functions. As one is super, super low pitch, and the other one is basically high pitched throat shredding. And together they sound great. This album takes a lot instrumentally from black metal at certain parts, which I think is great and very tasteful. Now, a lot of people, they kind of think about Cradle of Filth as this band that tried to be black metal and then kind of got soft, but I think that they are a really nice band to listen to, and this is my favorite of their albums. And there is also some of that orchestral stuff going on here. Like there's a song called A Gothic Romance, which begins with some kind of orchestra sort of processional, and it blends its way into a super gnarly metal song. And so this album is one of my favorites in the subgenre, so I would of course highly recommend. Next, we'll do my second favorite. Not that it's my number 2 favorite, but that both of them are some of my favorites within this subgenre. It's an album called Wild Honey by a band called Tiamat. Now, this Swedish band made this album that is as heavy as it is sort of beautiful. The riffs are slow and low pitch and brooding, yet this album paints kind of a seamless and vivid picture of like a loving romance. So it's a very warm and pleasant album, while at the same time having a very dark and sort of heavy emotional weight. It's kind of all over the place when you listen to it. It has like folk here and there, but I think that's in a positive way, and it gives this album sort of a progressive sound and also sort of a psychedelic quality as you're going through it. And the subject matter is obviously the most gothic metal thing ever. Like a beachside romance is sort of what the album is generally about, which is kind of random sounding, but surprisingly successful. So check it out. Next up, the band is Ecstatic Fear. The album is called Somnium Obmutum. I don't know what that means. They speak several languages on this album. There is lyrics written in Latin, English, and sort of Old German. Um, let's see. I've basically never really heard anything like this. Its approach to making music is sort of like they're writing a novel. It's very long and stretched out, but it's always very engaging, and the songs just kind of take shape as they go. It's really cool. It's a 4-track album where 2 of them are super long, sort of epic tracks, and then 2 of them are sort of like instrumental little pieces that are not as long. One of the songs like 32 minutes long, and the other one's like 19. So they're very, very long songs, and like I said, they kind of take shape as they go, and they just kind of wind along. Um, but the long tracks, they don't really seem as long as they are when you're listening to them, and they're very beautiful, basically, to listen to. And there's a lot of good riff writing, and there's so much kind of varied instrumentation. This album, like I said, I've never really listened to an album like this before, but this one is seriously cool. I would definitely highly recommend it, even though it's kind of an oddball. So that's why it's in my interesting category, but I do love it. And then finally, in my interesting category, and to sum up sort of my list of things I'd recommend you check out, I have this band called the Third and the Mortal with their album called Tears Laid in Earth. Now, here's what I kind of have to say. This album kind of feels like it's not approached like a metal album, but it definitely comes across as a gothic metal album in different ways. Just the sound, the heaviness definitely makes it metal. The singer, she does these clean vocals all over the whole thing. They're sort of pretty and operatic, and so it has that. Now, the instrumentalists on this album are incredible. Like, there's so many amazing like guitar and bass and drum parts all over this thing. The music is incredibly written, and but it is also so heavy. But the way it's written, it doesn't sound like it was written like metal music. It sounds like it was just written, sometimes just to kind of be really complex and sort of progressive rock. And it's a really kind of weird approach to writing metal, but it definitely sounds very metal. And of course, the singer makes it sound very gothic. It's another thing that's kind of like outside of my wheelhouse, because I don't normally listen to bands with vocalists that sound like that all the time. But I've definitely gotten used to this. I sort of swallowed the pill, if you will, and it feels pretty ahead of its time, especially for an album from 1994, which is the year it was made. It's definitely an art project, and it comes across as a very special piece of music, and it is a very gnarly gothic metal album. And so that is pretty much what I have to say. Here's the bands and the albums spelled out, so if you want to look into them, there they are. Thanks for checking out this video, and hopefully I'll be making some more videos and also continuing this metal series on all the very, very, very many subgenres there are of metal. And so thanks for watching.